The morning fog was not just water vapor, it was the dense mourning that hung over what remained of Jerusalem in the uncertain year of that catastrophe that had humbled Judah. Our protagonist was, and the only piece of information known about him was his name, which resonated with a bitter irony in that time of despair: servant of the Lord. He had no lineage to flaunt, nor a known profession to boast of. He was, in essence, a man made of silence and dust, living in the oppressive anonymity of a crushed nation. His life, until that day, was that of a phantom walking among the rubble, quietly witnessing the pain that bled in the alleys and in the eyes of the few remaining survivors. That day, however, would not be an ordinary day. He would be the voice that despair was crying out for. In that period of calamity, Obadiah felt a weight that did not come from hunger or physical exhaustion, but from a spiritual urgency that burned in his chest like embers. The injustice was not only the sacking of Jerusalem, it was the scorn and betrayal of Edom, the neighboring people who had delighted in Judah's fall, refusing to help and even blocking the escape of the refugees. The messenger, with simple robes and a face marked by the dust of the fallen city, carried an overwhelming certainty, a conviction that did not seem to have been born of his own mind, but had been deposited there with the force of a lightning bolt. It was as if Judah's own pain had found a receptacle in him, a human shell ready to explode into words of judgment, breaking the deafening silence of God that hovered over the ruins. Obadiah rose from the cold stone where he was sitting, feeling the call intensify not as a spoken command, but as the irrevocable movement of a tide within him. His eyes, which had previously fixed on the ground, cracked by drought and neglect, gained a brilliance that was not of human anger, but of an authority lent to him, something that came from a place much higher and deeper than the dust-laden skies of that day. It was as if the messenger's soul was being pressed to assume a form that was not his own, that of a spokesperson who needed to deliver something very heavy, but which would liberate him once spoken. He felt the usual fear, that fear of being too small for the task, but it was mixed with a sense of wonderment, a terrifying reverence. The sun had already passed the top of the sky, and the faint light of that grey afternoon only highlighted the desolation. But it was at that moment that Obadiah felt time bend around him. The vision did not come with trumpets or fire, but as a silent click in his mind, an absurd and immediate clarity that showed him, with details that only an omniscient observer would know, all of Edom's arrogance. He saw with the eyes of the soul the pride of that people who felt secure in their hiding places in the rocks, convinced that no one could reach them in their eagles' nests. And, along with that image, came the certainty of the sentence, the shortest and heaviest prophecy, engraved in his memory like a stone inscription, ready to be shouted to the world. What Obadiah felt was not pain, but a compression in the air around him, as if the atmosphere were being sucked away, forcing him to breathe the heavy silence of injustice. He walked out of what was once the main square of Jerusalem, and with every step he took, the ground seemed to vibrate, not because of his feet, but because of the silent fury he carried. His legs moved with a determination that was not his own. It was the inertia of a destiny that needed to be fulfilled, the urgency of a word that could no longer be contained. The messenger noticed that the few faces looking at him, faces marked by scars of loss and skepticism, seemed to ignore the aura surrounding him, except for an old woman sitting near a semi-destroyed wall, who stopped mending a piece of worn cloth and fixed him with eyes that seemed to have seen millennia. The old woman did not smile, nor did she greet him. She merely bowed her head, like one who recognizes a sacred burden, an envoy who finally arrives to break the cycle of suffering and betrayal. And this gave Obadiah a shiver that ran down his spine, confirming that he was not hallucinating. He was, in fact, the channel for something enormous. That moment of silent recognition, exchanged with the only person who seemed to notice the change in the air, solidified his conviction, removing the last vestige of doubt. He was no longer just Obadiah, the anonymous one. He was the voice, and his message needed to be delivered, no matter the cost, or to whom. The street he was following, which had once been the pulsing heart of commerce, was now covered with a thick layer of debris and fragments of broken hope, and the smell of ancient smoke still clung to the stones, a constant memory of the violence that had occurred there. Obadiah felt the word of judgment accumulating in his throat, and it was a physical sensation, as if he had swallowed a hot rock which needed to be expelled so he could breathe normally again. The focus of his journey was no longer Jerusalem, nor the suffering of Judah, but Edom, that proud nation that inhabited the rock crevices, laughing at others' misfortune and believing that their elevated location made them invincible. It was this pride, this arrogance, that the message needed to dismantle. He realized that every detail of that day, the cold light, the silence that swallowed distant sounds, the resignation on the faces, was serving as a stage for what was about to happen. He felt tragedy and inevitability mixing within him, transforming fear into a cold courage, the kind that doesn't shout, but merely is. He was being prepared with every step, with every stolen breath, to be the herald of the divine decree, and the weight of justice was almost unbearable to carry. But he kept moving forward. The anonymous messenger felt he needed to reach an elevated point, a place where his voice, however simple, could resonate over the ruins, reaching not only the ears of the few survivors of Judah, but mystically the distant ears of the traitors of Edom. He went to what remained of one of the city's oldest walls, a structure that, even partially torn down, still displayed the stubbornness and glory of a past that seemed to have been erased forever. As he climbed the cracked stone steps, Obadiah noticed that his sandals made a distinct, hollow sound, the only noise that seemed to respect the gravity of the moment, a sound that was almost a drum roll announcing the arrival of something inevitable. And there, at the top of that ruin, as the cold wind whipped his face, he felt the reverence for what was about to manifest. It was the sensation of being on the brink of an abyss, not of death, but of a truth that would change the established order of facts. Standing on the wall, with the landscape of destruction stretching out below him, like a map of sadness, Obadiah inhaled deeply the metallic smell of dust and desolation. It was at that moment that the feeling of omniscience that had been deposited in him became almost unbearable. He knew the secret history of Edom. He knew every detail of their arrogance, and most heavily, he knew the exact measure of the condemnation that was to come. The messenger closed his eyes for a second, and his whole life, his anonymity, his trivial fears, disappeared. Only the word remained. He felt the prophecy, not as a memorized text, but as a vibration that started in the bones of his chest, rising up his throat and begging to be released, a force that he could no longer, and did not want to, contain. He wasn't about to speak. He was about to be spoken through by a justice that seemed to have slept for a long time, but was now awakening with a calculated and precise fury. Obadiah opened his mouth, but what came out was not a guttural cry of despair or personal anger, but a sound that seemed to have the age of the mountains themselves, a vibration that resonated differently in the rarefied air. That was not the sound of a common man complaining, but that of the voice of an authority that had broken the silence of God on earth. He felt he was becoming a megaphone, and the word he uttered was as concise as an axe blow, direct and unadorned, focused entirely on the arrogance and betrayal of Edom. The messenger did not look at the ruins of Jerusalem, but toward the horizon, to the south, as if his eyes could pierce the distance and see the rock fortresses, where the Edomites hid, secure in their pride. It was crucial that the message be delivered there, at that point of maximum pain, so that everyone, living or dead, would know that the injustice had been recorded, and that the response would not be in the form of comfort, but of precise retribution. The first sentence Obadiah spoke caused a strange effect on the atmosphere. The wind, which had been whipping, seemed to suddenly calm down, and an almost supernatural silence swallowed the distant sounds of stray dogs and scattered lamentations. The old woman who had recognized him in the square, now distant, clutched the piece of cloth to her chest and fixed her gaze on the top of the wall, as if watching a scene that only happened once every 1,000 years. Obadiah felt the prophecy unroll from him like a scroll of fire, each word carrying the weight of a broken promise and the fervor of an irreversible judgment. He was not judging. He was merely reading the sentence that had already been engraved. In that moment he felt no tiredness, hunger, or fear. He was simply the perfect instrument, the pointer of a scale that was finally being reset to zero, and this feeling of being used for a purpose that transcended his own existence filled him with a sense of wondrous awe, a unique and unrepeatable experience. The strength of Obadiah's voice was not in its volume, but in the authority that filled it, and he began to declare the vision that had been shown to him, that Edom would be diminished, and that its pride, the one that made them live in the rock crevices and think they would never be reached, would be utterly undone. It was as if the word were creating an invisible trail of destruction, traveling through the air toward the distant mountains, dismantling the Edomites' confidence brick by brick, even without them knowing what was happening at that exact moment in Jerusalem. The messenger felt that every consonant and every vowel that left his mouth carried the memory of all the tears shed by Judah, and this gave the prophecy an emotional density that was almost palpable, as if pain were being converted into purifying fire. He described Edom's betrayal with surgical precision, like an omniscient narrator who had watched the scene in playback. They not only stood aloof, but watched from afar, rejoicing in the plunder, and even handed over the fugitives of Judah to the enemies. In detailing this wickedness, Obadiah felt not hatred, but a profound sorrow at seeing how far arrogance and lack of empathy had taken a people who were blood brothers, descendants of Esau. This feeling, more than any threat, gave credibility to his proclamation. It was the voice of an eyewitness, an account that could not be contested because it came charged with the truth of what had been seen from on high. He knew that this message was the end of complacency for Edom, the announcement that justice, after a long time dormant, had finally remembered to rise. As the words about the overthrow of Edom's pride were expelled, Obadiah felt that he was emptying himself in a powerful and strange way. It wasn't just tiredness, but the release of a pressure he had been carrying since the start of the day, a burden that was nonetheless the most precious thing he had ever carried. The prophecy was not just being spoken, it was being cast into the wind with a force that seemed capable of altering the weather, and the messenger saw, in his mind, the stone fortresses of Edom trembling, not from a physical earthquake, but from the irrefutable authority of the word. He knew he was doing something that would make him unforgettable for the divine purpose, even if he remained a complete unknown to the world of men, and this duality between anonymity and greatness filled him with a sacred terror, an experience that transcended any worldly joy. The afternoon light intensified for a brief moment, a visual phenomenon that only those focused on him would have noticed, illuminating the ruins in a dramatic way, as if the setting were receiving a special stage light for that single speech. Obadiah felt the muscles of his jaw tense from the intensity of the delivery, and his throat, dry not from lack of water but from the fire of the message, seemed to burn. He was describing a judgment so concrete, so inevitable, that it was more real than the rubble he was standing on. He had an intimate certainty that that word, short and blunt, would be remembered for its precision and its lack of mercy, not his own, but that of the justice he represented, which could no longer tolerate the scorn and cowardice of the Edomites. Upon finishing the proclamation of the irrevocable sentence against Edom, Obadiah did not feel a sudden relief, but an exhaustion that seemed to come from the soul, as if the force that had propelled him had suddenly withdrawn, leaving him merely as a hollow human body on the stones. The silence that followed was not the same heavy silence as before. It was a silence of conclusion, the deafening sound of a truth that had been spoken and could no longer be undone. He did not know if Edom had heard his voice in the literal sense, but he had the mystical certainty that the word had completed its trajectory and settled in the universe as a new reality, a promise of judgment that now merely awaited the moment of its manifestation. He leaned against the wall, his breath short, and realized that he was no longer anonymous to destiny, even if he remained invisible to the majority of men. He looked down at the street of debris and saw that a few figures had approached, drawn more by the strange aura of the event than by the content of the message, which to most was just another angry lament from a survivor. But they did not dare to approach. They kept a distance of instinctive reverence, observing him as if he were a living monument, a statue that had just spoken. Obadiah, in turn, did not see them as an audience, but as silent witnesses that, yes, in the midst of the greatest misfortune, the servant of the Lord had risen to break the silence of pain. The messenger knew that this was the peak of his mission, the day towards which his entire anonymous life had converged, and now, with the task complete, he felt the overwhelming need to return to the nothingness from which he had come. Obadiah descended from the wall with the same simplicity with which he had ascended. But the man who touched the ground now was fundamentally different. The fire of the prophecy had burned away all doubt and fear, leaving behind a strange, almost insipid peace, the calm that follows a storm that has devastated everything. He felt the eyes of the few witnesses still fixed on his back, no longer out of curiosity, but out of a silent perplexity that he could neither satisfy nor wish to. He simply walked on, and the world around him seemed to have returned to its usual slowness, with the dust and silence gradually reintroducing themselves into the atmosphere, as if reality were recomposing itself after being torn apart for a few minutes. He had nowhere else to go or what to do. His one-day task had been completed, and the urgency had disappeared, leaving only the way back. As he walked through the streets that became increasingly deserted with the advance of the afternoon, Obadiah realized that the experience had not made him a hero, nor given him any satisfaction of ego. What he felt was the radical humility of having been a mere conduit, a string that vibrated and broke the silence, but which now returned to its position as an inanimate object. He did not try to understand the logic of the time or place. He simply accepted that, for one day, he had been the point of inflection of divine justice on earth. And that was a truth that belonged only to him and the force that had propelled him. The weight of the judgment was no longer in his throat, but floating in the air on its way to Edom, and the messenger was free again to merge with the shadows and dust from which he had emerged. What lingered in Obadiah's mind as he headed to his modest hiding place was not the glory of having spoken in the name of justice, but the terrifying simplicity of how everything happened. There was no earthquake, no fire, no choir of angels, just a silent conviction that turned into precise words. He tried, with his human reasoning, to unravel the mechanics of that transfer of knowledge, of how the history and sentence of Edom had been etched into his mind. but it was like trying to hold smoke. The only conclusion was the most uncomfortable for a man who sought logic. He was used, and the experience was non-transferable, a secret he would carry with him, one that subtly separated him from all the other survivors of Judah. Upon reaching his small shelter, made of loose stones and a piece of worn canvas, Obadiah sat down and drank the water. He had stored in a cracked jar. The water tasted of dust and salt, but to him in that moment it was the purest substance he had ever tasted, a return to palpable reality after having touched the immaterial. He felt a tremendous loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but of having seen something no one else saw, and having to keep the secret that the scales of justice were again in balance. The sensation of wonderment and awe did not abandon him. It was as if he had become a witness to history, a guardian of a truth that was small in volume of words, but gigantic in significance. The rest of that day passed for Obadiah in a state of numbness, as if he were floating a foot above the ground, observing his own existence from afar. He performed the most basic tasks, adjusting the canvas to protect himself from the night wind, trying to find another handful of grains with an almost robotic mechanics, for his mind was entirely occupied reprocessing the density of those few sentences spoken on the wall. He felt that the experience had left an spiritual calligraphy on him that he could not erase, a sense of fulfilled purpose that contrasted brutally with the insignificance of his daily life. It was a heavy peace, the peace of one who carried the final decree of a judgment, and he knew that life would never again have the same mundane flavor as before. Nightfall arrived, bringing a deep, black, starless sky, as if even the light was mourning Judah's disaster. But Obadiah no longer felt the cold from before. There was an inner flame, not of physical heat, but of consummated truth that warmed him inside. He lay down on the cold earth, closed his eyes, and the only image that came to him was that of Edom's arrogance seen from above, and the certainty of its fall that had been announced by him, the man without a surname. He tried to doze, but sleep seemed trivial in the face of the magnitude of the day he had lived. It was as if he had absorbed time and destiny, and the fatigue of the body was not enough to turn off the memory of the revelation. It was in the middle of that silent night, when even the moon seemed to have hidden itself in respect for the morning, that Obadiah felt the final change in the air. It was not a sensation of threat, but of total emptiness. That weight he carried, the force that propelled him, the intimate knowledge of Edom's fall, all simply dissipated in the same sudden and inexplicable way it had arrived. He opened his eyes in the dark and felt that he was again just a simple man in dirty robes, stripped of any authority that was not his own. It was a strange sensation of relief and loss. The fire had gone out, and the messenger was again empty, the conduit closed. It was as if the mission had a one-day validity, and the word, once delivered, no longer needed its anonymous herald. The quietness that followed had nothing mysterious about it. It was the prosaic quietness of a cold night in a ruined city, the kind of silence anyone would expect. Obadiah felt an immense physical fatigue take over his body, the accumulated exhaustion of a day of intense spiritual tension that was now finally taking its toll. He realized that the experience had stopped without a dramatic final point, without a heavenly sign, but with the disconcerting simplicity of a radio being turned off. He had no explanation, no final voice of confirmation. Only the internal certainty that the mission was fulfilled, and that he should, from that moment on, return to being the Obadiah without history, the anonymous servant of the Lord who had spoken once on the exact day that justice needed a voice. Obadiah spent the rest of the night in an involuntary vigil, not out of fear or anxiety, but because his mind refused to let go of the details of that unique day. He relived the sensation of non-human authority in his throat, the way the wind fell silent, and the look of mute recognition from that old woman in the square. He knew, with a certainty that transcended any physical proof, that what he had said that day would become the final truth about Edom's downfall. It was a vivid and almost painful memory, the remembrance of having been larger than life for a few hours, and now having returned to dust, unable to explain how it had happened or why he, the man without a history, had been the chosen one. Upon seeing the first faint light of the new day dawn on the horizon, Obadiah finally managed to fall asleep, a sleep of pure human exhaustion. But he awoke a few hours later, feeling a strange emptiness in his chest. The experience had left no physical marks, nor had it changed his social status. He remained the poor man, without lineage and without a defined home, in a ruined Jerusalem. The only difference was the immutable conviction that justice, although invisible and often late, had manifested through him. That day, the day God's silence was broken, would remain with him as an invisible scar of reverence, the kind of secret one keeps not out of fear, but out of pure awe. Obadiah rose and faced the new day, and his most concrete and immediate action was simply to continue living, without trying to capitalize on the event, without seeking an audience or telling the strange story he had lived in one day. He knew that what had happened was of a nature so intimate and bizarre that telling it would make him seem like a madman or a charlatan, and the truth of that day was too precious to be trivialized. He picked up his empty jar and went in search of water, blending back into the gray landscape of hopelessness, a figure among the rubble, but now with the weight of a divine secret in his soul. A burden that made him walk with a silent dignity, noticed only by those who knew how to look beyond the surface. The great irony of that day was that the most crucial mission of his life had resolved itself without him needing to take any practical action to maintain it or make it happen again. The voice that he had been simply fell silent, and he accepted this abrupt and mysterious ending as part of the very nature of the revelation. Obadiah never tried to return to the wall to see if the strength would return. He did not pray for more visions or more words. The only thing left was the silent certainty that he had been the instrument. The event stopped as suddenly as it began, and the only explanation he had was that divine justice, once it had spoken, did not need to repeat itself, and life, though for him, had returned to its crushing routine of anonymity. What remained of that day, and what Obadiah carried for the rest of his historyless life, was the absolute conviction that justice had spoken through him, and that the prophecy from his mouth would become an irrefutable historical fact, even if no one knew who had uttered it. He never sought fame. In fact, he hid further in the radical anonymity that defined him, living out the rest of his days with the silent dignity of one who knows. He did the only thing he was created for. The experience never repeated itself. The silence was never broken that way again. Obadiah was, once again, just an anonymous servant, but the memory of the voice was his soul and non-transferable wealth. And so, Obadiah's life continued, marked by the lack of explanation. He could never fit the overwhelming force of that day into the logic of his world of dust and destruction. That event simply happened, and afterwards simply stopped, without an apparent cause for its beginning or its end. He remained the man without a surname, but with the intimate certainty that, for one day, he was the channel for something immeasurable, an invisible turning point in history. He never told the story in detail, but the way he looked at the horizon, with a reverent fear and a silent wonder, was proof that he had seen what was real, but what human reason would never be able to decipher.